I'm going to assume that people are on um, and start introducing myself. I'm Brian Young, Executive Director at Action Network and also proud board member at Netroots Nation. And before we even get going, I want to say when we were submitting panels, that was back when we thought there was a live version and this was going to be a live in-person panel because I know there's going to be people that know more about parts of this than anyone here on the stage. I really wanted a discussion because this is all about kind of getting together and talking about what we can do in this changing sort of data environment. We're not in person, but this is all an encouragement to dive into chat, ask questions, but also just talk with each other. Like I said, there's a lot of people that know a lot about this, and some of us know parts of it. And if we all come together and just chat about it and talk about it, we will be better off as a movement, which is the spirit of Netroots. So diving in, this is different parts of, there's a lot of things sort of lining up now, some with some consumer privacy pressure, some government, some even just companies doing things on their own for a variety of interests. And the environment's changing really quickly. So we're going to just kind of dive in. And we'll start with Amy, and introduce yourself and just kind of talk about the changes in email tracking. Apple is the big one, but open rates tracking, all that environment, people are talking about that a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I'm Amy Chinlai. I'm the Engineering Partnerships Manager at Action Network. So I manage our deliverability, advanced features, build some stuff. It's a great time. I'd like to give a big thank you to Netroots Nation for having us for this panel and Brian for putting it together and the rest of my panelists. But Apple changes. So in case you haven't heard the grumblings from basically anyone, in late September, Apple launched iOS 15, iPad OS 15, and Mac OS Monterey. And when this came out in June, July, they said there was going to be this feature called Mail Privacy Protection. I'll call it MPP for short because that's just a lot to say and I don't want to deal with it. But MPP prevents senders from knowing when a recipient has opened an email and masks the recipient's IP address, which is kind of unnerving. They do this by preloading the email, which shows false opens. So anyone using the native mail app, so not like the Gmail app, but just like the native mail comes with your iPhone app, will show as an open regardless of if they actually opened the email or not. So after a user updates to iOS 15, the first time they go to the mail app, they'll be prompted to opt in. So it's this nice screen, and I have a picture of it in my blog post that I hope one of my colleagues will send on its way if you are interested in what that looks like and have an Android or something. But it says, similar to the Ask Apps Not to Track, this is what it does. And do you want to basically have your privacy protected or not? So similar to the Asking Apps Not to Track back in iOS 14, this will likely see a really high adoption rate. The iOS 14 Ask Apps Not to Track saw over an 87% adoption rate, so this will probably be about the same. So just some background on how this technically works. For opens, there's this little transparent image in an email that gets sent by the sender. So you don't worry about it. Action Network does it for you or whatever email provider you're using. And when that image loads, that's what counts as an open. But I want to make this very clear that this has never been a perfect metric, ever. Not a year ago, not 3 years ago, probably since it was ever created. Outlook, Mozilla, Thunderbird, AOL, and Yahoo, just to name some of the big ones, are configured by default to block this automatic picture download. So by default, you weren't seeing any of these as opens. And Gmail also, which probably makes up a significant portion of your list, not including all of the companies that use G Suite, they load images inconsistently. So those may or may not have been loading either. And images can also be blocked by numerous other things, like the email client, a spam crawler, an ad blocker. All of those different things can prevent you from seeing if someone opened or masking them as false opens. So my analogy here that I hope makes some more sense is, those big balloon waving things outside car washes and dealerships, that sort of thing, meh. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know what I'm talking about. So those big balloon waving things, it's equivalent to 1,000 people driving past your big balloon waving thing and assuming that 1,000 people actually saw it. And you probably didn't see it unless you have some kid in the backseat that's super excited about it. So you can't really count those opens as real opens. So all of this to say, this isn't actually an apocalypse, because if you aren't in the spam business and you are sending good content to people that are opted in and you're sending the emails that they want, you don't really need to worry as much. Sure, you need to update your metric thresholds and you need to make some programmatic changes regarding your actives queries and such and your re-engagement campaigns. And there's plenty of resources that we can talk about and more on the Q&A if people have questions about that. But overall, not as big of a need to panic as you may think there is.
And I'll follow up with that a little bit, and we'll dive into the individual stuff. But that not an apocalypse, and it's not as big a change, but also just the importance of running good email program and the way this fits in. I'll jump to Patrick and want to introduce yourself and then talk about how you've just sort of dealt with this in general over the years and what you think about what Amy just said.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Patrick. I run the mobilization team at the DNC, which means I work with my colleague Jose here on running all of the digital and direct marketing operations at the committee. And I've been in this role since early 2019 and running also the grassroots fundraising operation before then. And I feel like in that time, we've had several rollouts of giant tech problems in one way, shape, or form, like policy changes from Google and Facebook and everything that we've been sure would like massively affect our ability to raise money. And there's no way to play out a counterfactual around all those. Maybe there are parallel universes where Google and Facebook make different policy changes, and we actually raised what, $1.1 billion on ActBlue in 2020 instead of just 900 million or something like that. That's an opportunity to brag right there. It's fine. But yeah, I think Amy's point really stuck with me, which is I think if you were running an email program that was overly reliant on email rates before, you probably weren't running a very good email program. And if you were just like focused in on one metric, or I think the same thing applies to ads. Julia's more of an expert in this than I am. But Brian, you made a really good point when we were talking about this in prep yesterday, where I think these changes almost advantage programs and people who are able to be a bit more nimble and how they're setting all of this up, and people who are being more adaptive and a bit more forward thinking. Now, of course, that's a resourcing question as well. People who are running smaller programs definitely have more of an issue with this. But I would say, broadly speaking, I'm somewhat optimistic that a lot of these changes really advantage some of the better actors in our space and disadvantage some of the worse actors in our space.
Yeah, I think, and I'll, because I've been thinking a lot about the sort of values inherent in some of this, and like I said, these are not all of these are done for sort of pure, pristine reasons. The actors who are pushing these changes, but I think in total they do, they could anyway. The resource challenges are real that you just mentioned, Patrick, but they will advantage values that I associate with progressive values somewhat on some of these, and some of the when you think about some of the stuff the Trump campaign did, for example, last time, and the way they treated people in data, they would be impacted heavily by this. So it's just something, one theme that we can kind of think about as we go forward. But I'll jump to Jose, because one of the big changes is, it's a little bit different just because of who's driving it, and thinking about the telcos who are behind a lot of the changes with mobile. There are some regulatory and Supreme Court decisions, but the whole 10 DLC and changes to how you can opt in and what you have to opt in, things that will make, for example, peer-to-peer, which is a very big resource for us all last year, much more difficult. But Patrick, you know a lot more about this than I do, so I'm going to kick it over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Nunez, currently the Deputy Political Director for Organizing at the DNC. So I oversee all of our organizing efforts. Previous to this, I was on the Biden-Harris campaign overseeing our digital and distributed organizing programs, which is important context because I actually wanted to start with some background information on when this whole chatter really started. It was about October of 2020. We started receiving on the Biden campaign some communication around possible increases in filtering of peer-to-peer texting that was happening. Obviously, in October, it is a very, very important time for us. We're doing mass GeoTV efforts and peer-to-peer texting as increased adoption has happened across political campaigns, advocacy groups, et cetera. It was incredibly concerning for us. And it was happening across three various big three carriers. It's AT&T, it's Verizon, it's T-Mobile. In our initial outreach, some of the anecdotes that we started to hear were crackdowns on possible spam, and also trying to limit misinformation and disinformation being delivered to some of their consumers. There was no chatter at that time about any kind of registration process, but what concerned us most was some of the inconsistencies in terms of what they were communicating, some of the practices and codes of conduct, as you will, would be implemented to reduce spam to their consumers. And at that time, we kind of have the same message even to date, which is, well, no one in the progressive space is against reducing spam. As a matter of fact, we know of lots of actors in the political space that would be more than happy to just send out disinformation and misinformation over text message. As we know, deliverability rates are high and open rates are going to be increasingly high over a text message. We were able to finish off that campaign with no issues after tons and tons of amazing work on the campaign side to make sure that we could finish off the campaign without any kind of regulatory changes on peer-to-peer texting. But immediately following the campaign, which I believe was around December of 2020, some of the 10 DLC chatter started to happen. Over the course of this year, it was a huge fact-searching mission. What we really kind of understood at that time was T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon were implementing policies that what we understood was going to effectively end our ability to reach millions of voters. And I'm putting this in the aspect of political messaging via person-to-person text messaging. It's important on what was just noted earlier, which is with the recent Supreme Court ruling, effectively ended human intervention as an argument for peer-to-peer text messaging, right? Because that was out the window. But still, we believe in this space, especially in political campaigns, that peer-to-peer texting is its own bucket of communication. And again, under what I believe is the guise of reducing spam, we started to hear about carriers lumping political and civic engagement text messaging and commercial and automated marketing campaigns. So they were trying to see them as the same. And also the policy set by the wireless carriers in consultation with CTIA was not recognizing peer-to-peer text messaging. As a matter of fact, it still doesn't. Instead, it's classifying all messages sent by any automated system. So, and again, that can be through aggregators such as Twilio and bandwidth, the places that the text messages and all the background information is happening, as the same as commercial application to person or ADP text messaging. You know, I want to reiterate again, we all agree, especially, and this is me speaking on behalf of any campaigner or the DNC as in our stance on this, we need to make sure that we have protections against fraud, unwanted commercial marketing, but at the end of the day, volunteer-driven person-to-person text messaging, especially when we're trying to get critical information to voters, especially in places where a text message is maybe the only way that we can actually reach a voter with important voting information. Trying to bucket that with commercial application-to-person text messaging is just not the same thing. To date, what we understand as well, which has been over many, many months of cross-collaboration with many different organizations and stakeholders and cross-committee, we have been trying to have conversations with the carriers themselves to really understand what is their approach. Do they understand the significance of how this could crush some of our abilities to reach voters? And folks might even have seen some recent news, especially around T-Mobile. T-Mobile had started to communicate an October 1st deadline for many political campaigns and actors that are using text messaging to register before they actually can continue to send text messages, and a lot of language around this ends everything for folks that may have ever done voter file messaging, for example. Just changes fundamentally the way that we can do peer-to-peer texting. They have pushed back that deadline to December 1st. Why? A lot of the carriers that we've discussed with don't really understand the scale of political campaigns. Folks, we had over 8,000 Democratic campaigns last year alone. And what we've started to surface is that the technical requirements to onboard that many political campaigns, I'm not even speaking for organizations, they're not prepared for it. Now, just to speak to the data piece and the impact that this could have on us if it was implemented as we knew it at least 6 months ago. Just to put it in context again, last year the Biden campaign sent 355 million peer-to-peer text messages in 5 months. Some folks might say, why the hell did you do that? Well, we were in the middle of COVID, right? And we were limited in our abilities to do in-person work. Nearly, I would say, 48% of all of our voter contact efforts came from text messages. So in the larger scheme of things, it was a huge component of our political communication with supporters and voters every single day. If the policies as we understand it currently were just set in place, it would limit our ability completely to be able to reach voters ever again. So I would just say, as of now, we still have a lot of work to do in communication around 10DLC, just in our limited ability to gather information for supporters, to talk to voters, make sure that they have the important information they need to actually vote, and continue to navigate this over the upcoming months. But as of now, we still have another window here. We have to continue conversations with the carriers themselves, which, as you know, you can make assumptions on, is not the most easy thing to do, because it's trying to explain a very complex political system and how campaigns work and organizations work, and how that's different from, for example, Uber sending text messages to their subscribers.
And I mean, this might be an unanswerable question, but I'll ask you, and if anyone else wants to, I'll give my bias. But when my brief time working as a staffer in the Senate, I ran up against, not directly, but through the work there, telcos, and still have psychic scars about that. And they're almost impunity to anything. They just set policy. It's unbelievable. Like, you know, at one point the public interest was so clear, and I asked someone, because the telcos were pushing the others, I said, well, what's their argument? And he said, well, they don't have one. They just did it. So I go, oh, okay. But what do you think? I mean, you mentioned in the guise of, at one point, in the guise of, in Alana's comment about still gets just as much predatory spam. You know, what do you think they're after here? What is the context you're working with them in? So I think guys is still important, just because I believe what they have done is try to implement policies without having conversations with the right stakeholders. Mm-hmm. I think that it's not just the political space, right? There's lots of spam that's coming through text messages all the time now. I think what they're trying to do is let's lump everything together. These policies would be perfect to reduce spam for all their consumers, but indirectly it's hurting a lot of the good work that advocacy groups and political campaigns are doing around voter engagement. And I think it's important. I'm coming in at the aspect of civic engagement communication, where I'm not talking about marketing, right? That's the biggest differentiator here. They have refused, at least at this point, to basically separate a lane for political communication, versus I'm not talking about, and nobody should be doing this, is any bad malpractices around fundraising over peer-to-peer texting. That's another thing that they're trying to reduce spam on. But to just simply make a decision about how we do communication over peer-to-peer texting, especially in the political space, and lump that with commercial application of person text messaging without any kind of advising cross committees, other organizations that are using large amounts of peer-to-peer texting, I don't have the perfect answer. And it has been, and just to put it into context, it's been, not kidding you when I say 7 months of fact searching. And every single day, and this is me also talking to Patrick, because we both work at the DNC, we learn something new every day, which tells you it's not only, they have some internal communication problems too, just to be clear. So, and it's something, because everybody's been very, very on edge, myself included, about what this means for our space. But I'm telling you right now, we learn something new every day. We have a lot of work to do, and I don't think it's as scary as some folks think. And we're going to ensure that nothing is actually implemented around an arbitrary deadline until we actually understand that political communication, civic engagement communication is actually protected. But their end result here, their end goal, I really do believe it's to end spam. I just truly believe they did not have enough conversations with us on the political side to really understand how this impacts our work. That's my understanding currently.
Yeah, Brian, can I jump in here? Like one of the things to know too, and I was actually on a briefing yesterday. I know a lot of the work that you all have been doing on the on the committee side to be able to advise all the campaigns and the consultants that work in this space. One of the things that I heard from the lawyers working on this at the Elias group were recommendations to don't go and register right now if you're on a campaign, right? You all are working behind the scenes really hard. I'm very grateful for it, but I want to make sure that everybody knows here that the current advice is don't go and register yet. Let Jose and everybody work in the background to try and get this resolved, because as you noted earlier, it's a really high barrier to try and get those 8,000 campaigns registered, and don't get locked into contracts with vendors that require you to follow these rules right now until the process gets worked. I know I'm anxious about how this shakes out. I can only imagine how those of you that are in those negotiations are. But the most important thing right now for those that are making decisions is to let's wait and let them do their work, so that we're not forced into compromises before we need to make them with our programs.
And could actually, let me just ask, I don't know if everyone's aware of what registering really means, what the process is.
So yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. So the registration process currently, there are two entities. There's Campaign Verify and the Campaign Registry. Part of our learning process, in some cases, we thought that they were two distinct registration entities. What we learned in June was that both are required to complete registration. They talk to each other. But separately, we were told by carriers that you only have to register through one entity. But technically, that's not the case. So this is just, again, to reiterate, in some cases, we hear different things from different actors and entities, but at the end of the day, we try to take from our carrier communication and take that to heart, because they're the ones that are really communicating all the way down to registration entities, to the aggregators, and our vendors that we use are really trying to work at the very bottom of all of this, right? And I would just actually, to lift up what Julia was noting, it is very important. One of the things that I will continue to tell campaigns right now, and what we were talking about for the last 2 months, there's zero incentive from what we understand currently to register. There's none. There have been anecdotes that, our deliverability is higher, but you're putting yourself in a bucket of a code of conduct that is continuously changing, that we don't have in writing necessarily. And remember that code of conduct and fines and penalties coming from the aggregators, we need to actually double check that with the carriers themselves. And that's what we've been trying to do. So what we now know, post this October 1 deadline with all this being pushed back, is our anecdote to understand that we still have a lot of learning to do here, because they were not prepared either. And the scale of it alone is not going to be sustained with our infrastructure, with their infrastructure that they have on hand at the moment. And I saw that there was one question on the screen around FCC intervention. That has been a conversation. I think that there is the long-term prioritization of setting a lane for political communication through peer-to-peer messaging. Then there is the short-term piece where we cannot allow this to impact critical elections we have, especially in one of the most critical midterms following the defeat of Donald Trump. So that's I would just say FCC, obviously, yes. But there's also been very good work on the DSCC front. I don't know if folks saw, there was a very important letter sent to the carriers from many senators, a lot of work that goes into that. The DGA around critical elections in New Jersey and Virginia, sending a letter that they're not registering either in those campaigns. The DNC stance currently is that we're not registering. And there is a risk tolerance, but from what we understand, there's no incentive. And you're putting yourself at risk to be penalized for something that is not wrong, which if you're maintaining best practices set by the CTIA, you're going to be fine.
And I think does anyone have a comment on Jason's question? If you've registered, do we push back with our current vendors?
I don't think it's necessarily pushback. I think you should have a conversation with your vendor. And there's something that we're also learning about, to be clear. So I don't want to say that this is the perfect example. We understand that there's an ability to unregister yourself, which is a new thing that I've been trying to learn about. Just to be clear, again, you learn something new every day. But I would just say have a conversation with your vendor. You don't have to publish who the vendor is or anything, but just have a conversation with them about what it would take to, if you wanted to unregister in the process. But again, I am speaking on behalf of what we understand currently and the timelines that we have. and many more conversations that need to be had to make sure that we do have a code of conduct and policy set that actually maintain best practices that we understand currently and protects our communication across the board. Last thing, if it's okay, Brian, I would just say,
for sure,
if you're running a shortcode program, you're running a broadcast program, that is very different from this. You have very different things you need to be maintaining in terms of best practices. And this is not to say also that you should go run a spam program either. Like, you are not going to be at risk if you are running a good personalized program. That's the same thing we tell the carriers. I'm not waking up every day and saying, I'm going to text 350 million people blindly without any type of specific objective or strategy at the forefront. So just make sure that you're running a good best practice program, and you'll be fine.
Yeah, and I'll make one other sort of contextual point that you mentioned the Supreme Court decision, because that in some ways, like, I'm not even it took away one avenue for the FCC to get involved on this, which is part of what's going on with the carriers, because the FCC on this particular point, there was a I think it was 1991 law, 92 law, somewhere around there, that defined, they tried to regulate what you could do with sort of, then it was auto dialers, and they defined it as sequential dialers then, because that's the way they work. They just march through phone number sort of numerically. And then a lot of regulations had sort of, and practices have grown out of that because the technology changed, but they still had the same sort of spirit of the law that the auto dialers were part. But then the Supreme Court decided that it was only sequential dialers. And we're very, the Supreme Court being the Supreme Court, would, use this textual argument to sort of undercut one avenue for regulation. So, I will, Jose's point, I will sort of echo that. I mean, it is a confusing environment even for the telcos now on what to do about this. So it's just and another thing, the other sort of big picture thing that's happening, well, there's a couple. I mean, Facebook Pixel is a real issue, and also there's a lot of changes, some happening and many anticipated, around browsers' use of cookies. And I know, Julia, why don't you just take both of those in whatever order you want to.
Definitely. So I'm Julia Rosen. I'm a partner at Partisan Campaigns, and we work with a bunch of nonprofits and Democratic candidates for office. And I've been in this space a long time. So I've seen how much has changed over the years, right? Running digital programs was a hell of a lot simpler back in 2004 than it is now, right? All of these things that we're talking about today, the through line for them is more complexity for program. It becomes harder to do the work, more labor intensive as a result. And as got noted earlier, really hard, particularly on the smaller the campaigns, the smaller the organizations, to be able to keep up and keep pace and stay on top of what is an increasingly complicated place, right? Like the ability to cookies and things like that, usually less of a thing that smaller groups deal with, and unless you're running a really big program at scale and you're trying to do very complicated marketing and following attribution and caring about what people view and how frequently they viewed it, usually it's less of an impact. The thing that I've seen more is the Pixel Armageddon, if you will, that happened over the summer. And it's similar to what Amy was talking about with Apple making moves around privacy. They pushed an update to their iOS, and it was 14.5, I think, at the time in the summer, right? No, now on to 15, ostensibly for privacy, right? Much like the email open rate change. These big companies are hearing pressure from government, from frankly a lot of regulations overseas around privacy that are a lot stricter than here, where they're trying to be protective of their users, but it comes at the cost to those of us that run program and, the corporate space as well, right? Everybody's affected by these changes, not just our little movement over here. And the tension that we're running up against are these two big companies sort of at odds with one another, right? You've got Apple trying to have privacy, and on the other hand, Google wants to be able to know what their users are doing in order to be able to know how to serve them really good content that they engage with, right? So if they don't know if a person's opening an email, they can't dynamically route an email into an inbox, right? In the same way that an advertiser wants to be able to follow conversion rate and conversion rate tracking. So the thing that changed the Pixel Mageddon was the privacy rules that Apple put into place caused Facebook to create an 8 conversion event tracking limit for domains, and and obviously we run way more ads than 8, right? And you need to be able to have last attribution, right? Know where people saw this, clicked, and then converted to sign up, to make a donation, what have you, right? And the fix for it was complicated. A lot of the advertising that we do, where we're doing direct response, right? Getting somebody to take an action and then serve them ad and then take action, is either we're getting them on a sign up form, or we're in a lot of cases for campaigns trying to do what's known as direct to donate advertising, right? Ask people to chip in. You see any number of videos of candidates speaking direct to camera. Please give me money. Look at my cute puppy. Please, 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 right? And we're tracking how well this ad does for this universe versus that universe, right? And so in order to then meet the needs of the requirements now, it required a lot of complexity. ActBlue, their solve for it involved a 7-page memo to folks like us of how they were dealing with it and all the steps you needed to follow for it, right? Again, to the point of really hard for smaller groups and smaller firms to be able to handle, and bigger groups can deal with it, but it adds this extra cost, extra time layer to handle it. It involves creating subdomains and bouncing it briefly to an ActBlue subdomain and then onto the subdomain of your organization, and that requires CNAME access and coordination with ActBlue, and unless you know how to do this all at a fairly sophisticated level and have access to your domain, right? Which, who knows who registered that domain 10 years ago, and is it in GoDaddy or Namecheap, and how the hell are you getting at that stuff? A lot of times can be even just a hurdle on its own, right? And so there's a hack, a kludge for it. It's not perfect. I definitely don't see clean attributions as much as I used to, and see a drop off. But again, through line is everything is getting more complex and harder to run good program. And what we're trying to do is to get good stuff to people and get them to take action and get involved, right? And it's harder to know if we're doing that or not. And it's harder, and more steps having to be taken to follow it and get the data we need.
And this is either you or Patrick or both. Has it affected your thoughts on digital advertising and how you approach it? Especially the cookies and the targeting that is.
It makes it harder for me to say yes as a firm to small spends, right? I can't, it's really hard to work with small down ballot candidates who come to me and I've got a $2,000 to $5,000 budget, and I'm wow, it'd take me 5-10 hours to just get that set up from scratch, right? And I can't do it. It doesn't make any sense, right? Because the metrics on you spending $2,000 to $5,000 will charge you a 15% fee on that. That's a couple $100, and it's so many hours to do setup. Right, that's where it becomes really a crunch. a lot. When you have bigger groups and bigger organizations, you're acting at a more sophisticated level. They can handle that, right? Because that time suck isn't as big of a deal relative to all the other work that you're doing once you have things up and running.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear Julia say that about smaller organizations. I think that's really like a through line of all of this, is just like organizations that are not like massively resourced in terms of digital marketing. I mean, to Jose's whole point, like Jose is literally one of the world's leading experts in like texting regulation at this point, right? And like only so many organizations can employ someone like that to figure it out, right? So I kind of think another part of this, and Julia, I'd be curious if you think I'm on or off about this, like 54% of ad dollars, I think, were on Facebook and Google, like not just political, but like across platforms.
Totally.
I don't see how that number is just not going up every year, right? Like, and it's a little bit like, why are you even advertising on non-Facebook, non-Google platforms, especially like as cookies depreciate at this point, especially if like you don't have a larger digital marketing operation.
Yeah, right. It's get complicated. And, one of the things that I found most surprisingly as I got in and spent more time in the advertising space is just like how old school sometimes this stuff is. Like, if you want to get money up on Pandora, you're literally sending insertion orders and signing things and wiring cash, and they're placing it for you. It's not a self-serve platform, right? Like it's like how you'd get a print ad up in dealing with right? And so because of that level of knowledge and knowing who those salespeople are and all of that work, right? It becomes a lot easier for people to just do the self-serve and deal with, Facebook ad platform is awful as a product as that is the worst piece of software I've ever had to deal with. And anytime I go into Facebook Business Manager, I hate life. It still is, you're going to reach people where they are, and that's where they are, right? And when you have vendors like Twitter shutting off access to political advertising, obviously TikTok you can't get at. Snap, though, right, really underutilized, right? Lots of people there. Pandora is a great place to reach a bunch of folks that just aren't on other platforms, especially their free platforms. When you're not trying to reach, middle-aged white folks, right? To be honest, but yeah, it's more complex, more platforms, but Facebook, Google are the big ones. And so anytime Facebook, Google, Apple make changes, it has big impact.
I feel like we've been depressing for small organizations. I know some of this is like, I mean, that's what happens with these big companies. They make things harder, so the big companies can do it. But what you had a couple of thoughts just now, Julia, but anything else that we can think about? Amy, how about on email? You mentioned a couple of things earlier about what not to sort of pay attention to, but a smaller organization, the DNC has many metrics they can look at. They have a scale, but smaller organizations, how can they approach kind of their email program?
Yeah, and this is a question that we face a lot. Action Network, we out for a free tool for smaller organizations. So we've had a few of these questions come through. And one of my favorite strategies that I think is pretty easy to implement is just sending more emails that are meant to drive clicks with really low bar call to actions, like wish our executive director a happy birthday, or this other public figure, or this, a simple like reconfirm you want to receive email from us. Not that they have to do it necessarily, but just prompting people to click and engage with you a little bit more and making these really low bar asks so that people are actually able to do them. Because there's such a large segment of the population too that's probably on your email list that doesn't have the ability to donate, especially right now while we're still, virtual and in the midst of a pandemic. You have a lot of people that unfortunately, don't have the means to do that. So you still want to give them the opportunity to be active. And I think low bar actions are a really great way to do that.
Definitely. My advice to small groups is always create good content, right? Like write good, compelling, interesting things. That is always the best thing to do, right? People get think they need to be acting very sophisticated and running tests and things like that to like that's how they're going to maximize their programs. And the truth is, it's copy matters more. I'm sure Patrick can tell you the level of detail of testing on the DNC's email program that they're able to do. But I also bet that the thing he sees the biggest, changes from are like just writing one copy version versus another, right? You see an exponential difference in performance based on what it says, not like the color of the button or what the button or the fancy layout that you've got there. Good copy, good content, good compelling things.
Yeah, I would just say to piggyback off Julia's point, like the competitive advantage of an organization like the DNC is we have 45 people on our digital team. The competitive disadvantage of the DNC is like 17 lawyers have signed off on everything we put out into the world, and I do think that's to Julia's point about just like compelling content. Like if you're a smaller organization, you have the competitive disadvantage or advantage of not having to involve white counsel in your stuff, hypothetically speaking.
Totally. I see a couple questions around ads here that like I can answer pretty quickly. Brian, Spotify,
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Yeah, great place to spend money. Lots of people there, especially younger folks. 10K or less budgets? No, I'd just go on Facebook. Make sure you're doing Facebook, Instagram. You'll get your best bang for a buck and easiest to manage. Don't make it more complex than it needs to be.
One thing I'd like to ask Jose, because one thing about the peer-to-peer is personal contact, and a lot of some of your work now, working with state parties, the relative importance with these shifts to person-to-person contact in every way. Like real organizing programs, whether that makes that even more, it's always been a critical part, but relatively even more important as we go forward.
So just the general idea that peer-to-peer texting, 10 DLC,
peer-to-peer texting,
impacts.
Yeah, but not just that, programs, there was the relational organizing tools last cycle. There's some other programs that you're running, and just, I'm kind of adding in, because a lot of this is about Blast. And the 10 DLC is an interesting one because it's kind of crossing the line into sort of, personal peer-to-peer, which is one of the points you're making. But I was just kind of drawing that out and see if there's anything there on kind of thinking about the ways we reach people differently. And then there's a couple of questions like Will's question about email I want to get to.
No, it's actually a very good point. I mean, the approach that I would take for organizing a mini program, and I should say this out loud, we are not 100% reliant on peer-to-peer, right, to be able to talk to people. It cannot be the only method that we have conversations with people. As a matter of fact, in addition to that, not everybody can afford to send that many peer-to-peer text messages at any given time. You'd have to be, again, very strategic on how you're using it. I would say some other methods that we're trying to think through for longevity reasons, and to your point, Brian, around state party infrastructure, for example. We've been trying to do a ton of work on just making sure that we sustain volunteer infrastructure long term, and how we leverage our personal connections within our supporter base to be the messenger long term. I think in a perfect world, peer-to-peer is not necessarily one of the core methods that we're having to communicate with people long term, and trying to build relationships in other ways that is going to be more sustainable is important. I think that is long term what I'm going to work towards. I think to put a better term on it, you could be saying relational, but I think that it's going to take more than what we have seen, at least in the last few years, is just technology to solve that problem. It's a lot of training infrastructure. It's a lot of staffing infrastructure. And it's actually making sure that people have it as a priority at the top of their mind going forward. I do not see, if I would just put I'm going to probably get in trouble for saying this out loud, but I don't think peer-to-peer texting, as we've seen cycles of different things being important to us. I think peer-to-peer is just going to be like a normal call sheet for phone banking currently is, right? I think for now, though, it is still such a critical communication tool for us, especially as we're still to this day navigating the COVID pandemic, right? Like we can't just say and peer-to-peer texting forever, and we're just going to go back to going to canvass every single door in the country. Can't do it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a through line, which we'll get to in a second, but here's a quick question. I don't know the answer to this. I don't have an answer. If there's just a kind of a basic 101, besides this panel, of course, on the data changes and ramifications for running ads. Anyone know of one?
Not that I know of off the top of my head. So much of this is in people's heads, and because it intersects with so many different platforms, and because our work is so unusual compared to what the private sector does, right? Yeah. Frankly, it's donations that are the thing that's different, that I don't know of anything. But the folks over at ActBlue are very helpful. Go ask them things, especially if you're trying to do, donation captures. And I saw a question about the form opt-in, the lead gen stuff in Facebook. Yes, those are great. They're not always better than sending people to your form in what you get out of people and how active they'll be. And so it's complicated. It's the answer to so much of this.
And the one thing I was, Will asked a question up thread a little bit that I'll get to, because one of the themes of what you said, Jose, and I think kind of in what you said earlier, Patrick, about what is not an apocalypse about this and the importance of treating people with respect. And a lot, I hear Patrick and team talk about a lot of the relationship with the people on the email list and treating them with respect. And I think that's kind of it's a theme to a lot of even what I said about sort of the ethics and progressive sort of values in here. That it's a lot about treating people with respect, and that if we do that, that's always important. I'm gonna, obviously Amy probably knows, and I'm gonna call on her for this one because we think about this all the time. As an email as a core email provider. To the movement, and we have a pretty strict opt-in policy, and what to do about that, how to enforce that. But Amy, you can just talk about the importance of opt-ins, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we take opt-ins very seriously at Action Network, and I would encourage other platforms to take them just as seriously as we take them. This is something Brian and I talk a lot about. But opt-ins are important for your deliverability. They're important for respecting your email community. You don't want to email people that don't want to receive your emails. Your deliverability is going to suffer, and you're not going to get the things out of them that they want to. I kind of wish my email ethics panel was after this so I could lead into that. But I don't know, there might be a recording floating around. But big shout out to Will Easton for starting this conversation at Netroots last year. But I think regarding his question about email swaps and list buys and trades, this is something that's actually explicitly prohibited in our terms of service and acceptable use policy, is that people can't take information from our activists and send them to other people without their acknowledgement and their confirmation that that's okay. And so I think it's up to platforms when we get reports of that to enforce this. And I think also as the individual subscribers, we may not make up much of an email list, but our spam complaints mean a lot. So if you're getting emails from people that you didn't opt into, that spam button is powerful. So might as well use it.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with any of what Amy said. I think it's all absolutely true. And the thing that I see named in the chat here is that congressionals are the worst actors in many ways with this stuff, right? And the reason for that, there are lots of reasons for that. And I came into, I hadn't worked with congressionals in a while and started to a few cycles ago. And the basic answer to this is that they're starting from scratch, right? Like I have campaigns that start off with maybe 800 friends on it, and they need to scale their list to, probably 100,000 or more in a couple of months. And they're starting off with no money in the bank, and they're not starting off with any assets, right? And so the investment they have to make up front in their email program, if they were just doing opt-ins, right, would be $1.50 to $5 a name times 100,000 people is a lot of money. It's a huge percentage of their budget. They don't have it. And absent some other group helping them get opt-ins, the D-Trip, I don't know, any, other groups, they're up against a decision point of, should I spend $1.50 to $3 on opt-ins or 25 cents a name for non-opt-ins and be off to the races. And the truth is that while you don't have opt-ins and you do deal with some spam complaints, when you're dealing with a time horizon of a year and a half, it's worth it to the campaigns to battle with a bit of deliverability issues for that relative, cost differential, right? And because there isn't a stat that folks can say and hold up and say, this is the cost of it, of not doing this, of like you will raise X less money, you will end up taking your list deliverability, right? The consequences of not having opt-ins isn't clear or understood. Instead, what you have are folks like Amy saying, it'll work better, we should all do this, it's the best way to treat people. And so you have ethics up against like cash money, real, we've got to win an election in a year and a half. And it's really hard. And that's the fundamental tug pull of why this happens.
Jose, why don't you, the peer-to-peer providers requiring?
It's a very good question, but a very heated one right now in all these conversations. But it's good because there is a lot of misinformation already on this question. So here's what we understand currently. And this is why we were encouraging people to not register, because we were hearing different things in our communication with a lot of different actors in this 10 DLC process. Number one, before I get into this, again, I think similar on the same bucket, I personally, no matter what size campaign, I don't care if there was only $50 in your budget as a campaign, don't go buy cell phone numbers and then just randomly text them, because that hurts our cause in fighting 10 DLC, period. There has to be really a strategic approach, where you found the numbers, why you're texting them in the first place, especially in the form of political communication, not for any type of marketing purpose. And that's just like a very distinct thing. From what we understand currently, there's no technical ability to cross-check if a number was opted in or not. So then they dig into different ways to do that. For example, when you do a peer-to-peer texting campaign, you're probably, I hope, tracking how often your folks are opting out. If I looked into a campaign that someone was sending with more than 30,000 contacts in it, and your opt-out rate was 30%, you probably shouldn't be texting those people and would question where you got the list or the messaging that you're using. That goes back to some of the CTIA best practices. There is no filter process. There's no understanding currently how it would even be possible to even know if someone was opted in your peer-to-peer texting list. There are opt-out rates, spam rates, other ways that you could make assumptions on whether or not a number was opted in or not. But again, that's why we went in the direction to understand currently in that registration process. I'm not signing anything that says there's an opt-in clause, because they can't even define what an opt-in is in their mind. So I know that's not the most helpful answer. It's another question we're navigating, but right now, there's no way for them to cross-check whether a number was opted in. They can use other arbitrary ways to track whether they think a number is opted in, and have the ability for them to kind of do an investigation into the list that you were texting, which can then be slapped on by fines and fees. But all of that, as we now know, has been delayed, at least in part of the registration delayment, until December 1st. And another question that we're going to continue to try to answer with the carriers respectively around how they're actually trying to implement that type of code of conduct.
All right, we are just a time check. We're coming up on 5 minutes to the end. So any questions, get them in now, because it usually takes a couple, 2-3 minutes to answer. So The Benji just asked a question that we will get. So the little bit of the, I don't know if you call it tragedy of the commons, it's a word that's used a lot. Not quite right here, but anyway, you can see his question as well as I can.
Yeah, that's where, I mean, I've talked about this with folks in the past. That's where we could fix this, right? There are congressional races that happen every cycle. And so the question is, how do you take the list that existed the cycle before and then use it for the next cycle, right? Of how do we facilitate that handoff in a way that allows people to opt themselves back out, right? And I don't know if we'll ever get to an opt-in on it, but an easy off-ramp to get people off that aren't interested in this district anymore, I think is the much more likely scenario. That'd require like the D-Trip to own the lists and to do a federated chaptering in Action Network or something like that, right? Like all of that is technically possible. It would just have to be, it's a lot more tricky politically, right? And getting the agreements from the candidates. And then the question is like, what happens in competitive primaries? Do they both get the lists, right? Like, what's the answer there? It's solvable. Somebody would have to make it a big project. And it, again, isn't there's a lot of anger out there about the practitioners doing it, but they're doing it for a reason. And, you know, I saw the question of like lose their provider over it. And the answer is like, that's not the stakes right now. Right. And until there's like somebody big that comes in and like, we're going to solve this problem, or we're going to make this so painful for you that you have to abandon your practices. But the abandoning your practices would be, to be clear, in a unilateral disarmament of ourselves compared to the Republicans, because they're not going to force them. We're not going to, you know, if our providers require us to do opt-ins and it increases tremendously the costs that we have to spend on acquisition, the Republicans are not going to do the same thing. Again, that goes back to higher regulations. Like if the FCC is going to like regulate this, great. But the playing field also has to get addressed. Yeah, it's tricky. It's hard. It's hard. This is really hard stuff.
Right. And Julia, to echo your point, like there's just no way this works with a competitive primary because, like, you know, what level of candidate and, you know, so on and so forth. I would also just say, just like, and I don't know, maybe I'm like past the point of jadedness on this, doing this for a while. Like, from a macro level, everyone's really happy with the state of Democratic grassroots fundraising right now. Just like every cycle over cycle, just act blue, just up. And to Julia's point, I there's just not a consequence being administered to any of this that's sufficient to combat it right now. And I think that consequence will eventually be Democratic grassroots fundraising doesn't continue to explode cycle over cycle. And it just, frankly, it's hard for me to see what would force a reckoning on this before then.
Yeah, I think there's there's not a lot of real information about this. There's a lot of assumptions thrown around sometimes around this question, and what the effects are, and if there even is a tragedy of the commons. And there's, I've seen a few studies on both sides, that are sort of suggestive but nothing real. So, when it comes to the consequences, what are they? And that's something that I've thought about as well, with our position about actually how can you look in this? I know Act Blue's done some stuff, but it's just these are hard questions, and even if you do find it, I've heard of other major institutions that had big studies done, but if you're not ready for the answers, and that's to Patrick's point that that when you get into primaries, it's impossible. I mean, when I first started Action Network, I thought the federated, party committee thing was a cool idea with candidates and email lists, but now I think, was I ever so young? So anyway, we're coming up. Any last sort of sum up thoughts from any of y'all?
it's going to get worse, right? Like, not to end this on a downer note, like, but that's where we're headed. And like, and the most important thing is that, and I'm grateful for Netroots to create these spaces, is that we all share what we know with each other and look for more ways to do that, and to be open with what we've learned and share with others, because we're all trying to do the same thing, which is win and pass legislation and get more people elected. And that's how we keep working on this.
All right. Unless anyone has anything to add to Julia's realistic comment, we're at time anyway. So if this was live, we could keep talking in the room and people would mill around, but it's not. So I think we're going to get cut off. So thanks, everyone.
Everybody.